it's crazy how much of Bruno's run in the early years, there was no TV at all. I mean, it's kind of one of the craziest little.
Oh yeah, in New York now. To clarify for the younger kids, the rest of the territory had television, but New York lost it for 65-ish right after the run with Watts, where they sold out 65 to 68-ish.
Yeah, I was going to say 68, so I think that's probably when it started too. So yeah.
And imagine they were still running the Garden. The houses weren't great, but imagine if they hadn't had Bruno. Modern day might have been different because they might have lost the Garden in the 60s if they hadn't had Bruno to draw what was being drawn with no television. Because he had just come off strings where he was selling out with everybody, and especially with Watts. I think they set a record. Then there was no sellouts because there was no TV. And then as soon as they got TV again, in late 68, 69, and moved to the new Garden.
That was the other big thing.
They start selling out again. Bruno's still on top. Yeah. But if they hadn't had him, Jesus Christ, they might have we might be talking about Uncle Jimmy Crockett now instead of Uncle Vince.
Well, you know what? Here's a funny little thing we'll do. This could be fun. So let's do this scenario. It's 1966. Bruno leaves, and they don't have TV. So the scenario you just laid out, it comes to fruition. The crowds drop the way we think they would. You lose your stranglehold on the Garden. Who is actually there to pick up the Garden? There's always someone who wanted to come into New York and take the Garden. It's just Vince McMahon Sr. was able to really, with Toots Mondt, get the hold on it, and no one else was ever able to break that ever again. But if they had lost it in 66, let's say, who would have been the one to go after it?
Verne Gagne.
You think, because Verne had wrestled in the Garden years earlier, obviously, out of Chicago.
Yeah, Verne had been there during the TV boom, and he knew. And remember, Verne was the one who, when LaBelle went out of business in Southern California, he tried to go out there. He tried to go out to Salt Lake. Anytime there was a major market, it seemed like that fell dark, and there wasn't a lot of them in those days, but it happened. Verne would try to pick it up. I don't think none of the Southern territories would have gave a fuck, probably. Well, give a fuck, have Madison Square Garden if they could sell it out, yes, but would have put the money and time and had the talent and the capability to go. It's a long way away from their territories, and they had their set methods of doing business. But Verne had a similar schedule. He ran most major markets, didn't do a lot of small shows. Now, maybe, and at that point in time, he was still forming the territory. But he was willing to expand and go out and to have to fly guys and et cetera. He probably would have been because if the Garden came up for grabs and the city of New York, they were still running the rest of the WWF territory, Boston, Philly, et cetera, et cetera. So it would have been a situation where you would have had to co-opt it like some kind of cooperation like the Tunnies did with Crockett in Toronto. And then later on with Vince in Toronto. But I bet you Verne would have wanted it. But didn't he try? He tried to fight LaBelle before LaBelle went out of business in like the early 70s, didn't he?
Late 60s, I think he went out. Well, Dick the Bruiser, remember, they brought Dick the Bruiser and Verne out there to go against LaBelle. And that was really the one time that the NWA got behind LaBelle and backed him up against, it wasn't about, it wasn't about it being Verne. It was just more about anyone coming in. And Dick the Bruiser had been a top WWA star before. I mean, that's where the WWA in Indianapolis comes from. In some bullshit kayfabe history, title history, it all makes sense somehow. But Dick the Bruiser WWA comes from him being the WWA champion when it was one of the major world championships in Los Angeles. So Verne had tried that. And Verne, there you go.
Verne was a territory stealing motherfucker. No,
he was a young guy too. Still in '66, he wasn't old man Verne yet. He was still a young guy.
Yeah.
Still had progressive ideas. He had the talent. And you got to think if he's in New York and Vince still has all those other markets, like you said. Although Tony Santos is still running in Boston, so it's not like they're the only game in town in Boston. But, there's other people. The closest people that could help you out and supply you with talent that aren't Vince is Tunney in Toronto. And who was Tunney working with at the time?
Detroit.
Okay, so
Detroit and Toronto, because that was during the reign of the Sheik. The Sheik would have been more liable probably to help Gagne than to help Vince since he worked. Well, I don't know.
What's Gagne's relationship with Barnett?
I don't know what it would have been like at that point in time.
Both come out of Chicago, so I mean they knew each other. Obviously, we don't know what the relationship is. But
it's interesting that in the 70s when Barnett was still in control of Georgia, Nick Bockwinkel was used on TV. Bobby Heenan came down there and had a run. They talked.
The Crusher,
and at the same time also. But now here's the thing: the Crockett territory, the Mid-Atlantic territory, would have been drivable because Richmond, Virginia is only a 2-hour drive from Washington, D.C. So if you wanted to get talent into the New York and Northeastern corridor there, you could have also brought it from the Carolinas. Vern did not have a relationship there, but maybe he would have struck one. Was there an uneasy truce between old man Crockett and Vince Sr. over their northern-southern boundary? That would have been interesting.
I don't know about 66, but you know who would have gone after it if it was a couple years later? Pedro Martinez.
Oh, my God, yes.
That's the one.
Yeah.
But if Barnett,
Buffalo and Cleveland.
But if, let's say Vern and Barnett have a good relationship, and we know Barnett's relationship with television, in different places. We don't know anything about his relationship with anyone in New York, but Barnett also has a good relationship with the Sheik. The Sheik actually paid him. The producer and Wilbur. So you'd be able to have, and Vern obviously has the business relationship that opens up in Chicago that year with Snyder and the Bruiser. So you have enough of a relationship with some of the new generation of wrestler promoters that are all young at that time still, that it may, here's the thing. If you don't have Bruno, and Rocca probably is not in a place to headline at that point, I would think.
I wouldn't have thought he was. No.
Who do you run with? Who you putting on top in the Garden? Is it Vern?
It better not be.
Right.
Vern would not have gotten over. Even at that point in time, New York was not built on wrestling wrestlers. It was built on ethnic baby faces and big, powerful heels. And the only time that the mold had been broken in decades was Rock and Perez as a team drew great. They were ethnic baby faces. Usually it was one top guy.
Right.
But once again, of all, I think if anybody had been able to get the contract on the Garden, somebody would have become available. Pedro Morales was hot in the 60s in Los Angeles because of the Hispanic audience. That's why he got the chance later on. Would it have happened earlier? Would it have been a Pepper Gomez?
I've got an option, and he's someone I've talked about a lot on the Super Podcast lately, so that's why it's fresh in my mind. Mark Lewin, who would have been ethnic for New York because he's Jewish.
Well, I think the Italian audience and the Hispanic audience was proven. I don't know the Jewish audience was proven.
In New York, it would do good. I'll tell you that much.
But what about even one of the Torres brothers from Atlanta, Barnett? Enrique Torres, who had been a world champion level guy in California years before, but not too many years before. The 60s, it was a different talent pool. Yeah. And I'm sure they would have found somebody. It wouldn't have been Bruno. Bruno was the perfect guy, and he was the guy.
Bruno was the perfect guy.
But I'm sure they would. It might have looked like after a while, it might have looked like Watts trying to find a JYD replacement, but they would have found somebody that fit that ethnic babyface.
Well, I'll tell you, there's the other interesting thing. At that point in time in 66, it had happened already in Los Angeles. In the Northeast, could they have gone with an African-American champion? If they had gone with Bobo in 66 in New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, would it have worked? Even though Pittsburgh was technically its own thing, you know what I mean? And actually, if Bruno's not there, Pittsburgh may not be involved at all now that I say it.
Yeah, they could have done it. I want to say Bobo would have been the guy to do it, but I get from seeing Bobo. Of course, I didn't see him in the earlier days, and he did a tremendous job when with the feud with the Sheik when they would put the U.S. belt on him or whatever. But I always got the impression of Bobo as always the bridesmaid. I don't know if they'd actually made him the guy, whether it would have worked or not, because. But Bearcat Wright was still around. Was that before or after he had pissed him off by not dropping their world title in California?
Exactly. Yeah.
But it would have been interesting. And that's, the one thing is they were able to keep the Garden going through those years, because even with the population in New York, just the newspaper advertising, they were able to keep it going, but it certainly wasn't the business that it would have been, which I guess was our original point. Without TV, nobody has ever done consistent live business for very long. And
with TV, you could sell out against Crusher Verdue. That's the point.
Exactly. Well, hey, if the Rolling Stones are playing a special concert in Louisville and I don't know it, I'm not going to go.
But if they're playing with Crusher Verdue,
and they're playing with Crusher Verdue and it's on TV.